Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I want to do this colored pencil landscape, and for the surface I'm going to use drawing paper covered with some clear gesso. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit first, and then we're going to get to the drawing process. So this is the paper I'm going to be using. This is the Fabriano drawing paper. It's a sand colored toned paper. But I covered it with some clear gesso. I used Winsor and Newton clear gesso. And what it does, it creates a surface that's similar to sandpaper. So it's kind of rough and it has a little bit of a texture. I don't think it's as good as the 1000 grit smooth sandpaper that I normally use, but I just want to experiment a little bit with this surface, and I'm also going to try out some other types of clear gesso. But for now, let's see how this goes. First, I'm going to do a sketch to work out the composition, and often with landscapes you don't need to do too much. It's often as simple as just drawing a line to decide where the horizon will be. And here that'll be enough. So I started with a dark green pencil to draw the line of those hills in the back, and the ones on the right here are going to be kind of bluish because they're even further away. So that's it for now. After that, I'm going to start working on the sky. I want to draw a slightly darker, more greyish, cloudy sky, and I'm going to start with sky blue colored pencil. Now already I can tell that the way the pencil interacts with this surface is quite a bit different from both regular paper and the sandpaper I've used recently, because it's much more rough. It grinds down on the pencil and produces quite a bit of residue. But we'll see how it goes. In case I haven't mentioned, the pencils I'm using are Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. So I tried blending a bit with a brush and with a tortillon, and what I found was that when I blend with a brush, it tends to reveal a little bit too much of the background color of my paper if I push the brush a bit harder. So while this can be blended, you need to be careful with brushes, because if you push a little bit harder, it just reveals the background color. So now I'm going to try to draw some clouds on top. I should probably have done the background first. I should have put the background color first, but I want to experiment a little bit more, so I put down some white colored pencil and then some light cool gray for the lower part of the cloud, just to make a slight transition. And then I dabbed on that with a brush, and it does work as long as you put down enough of the pigment and as long as you control the amount of pressure with a brush. But so far I'm not too happy with the fact that when I try to blend it more thoroughly, it just gets removed with a brush. So now I'm going to try to do a little bit of blending with a finger, and it's producing a slightly different effect, I can tell, because the skin and the natural oils from your skin, they appear to be pushing the pigment into the paper a little bit better so that it sticks to the surface. And it can be blended this way as well. It's also a little bit faster to blend this way, but I don't think it's blending as smoothly as a brush because it's leaving a lot of texture. So what I decided to do eventually here was to cover the background first with my colors, mostly with the sky blue, and then do some blending using a combination of my finger and brushes. I added a touch of light phthalo blue as well to see if that'll work, but I mostly decided to stay with those grayish tones, so a combination of sky blue and light gray and a touch of white here and there for the top of the clouds. So like I said, I'm trying to create a slightly darker, cloudier scene. And as you can see, I'm blending using a combination of my finger and a brush, and so far it appears to be working pretty well. You can't really see all of the details because my camera can't really capture all of those details and textures, but the background color of the paper is coming through a little bit when I use the brush, but I am sort of able to smooth it out and to achieve fairly even coverage. So I think it'll look good. I would say that in comparison to the regular paper, with the regular paper there would be less residue and the pencil would stick to the paper a lot better, but here I can use that residue and move it around and blend it. But like I said, you have to be careful when blending, because if I overuse my blending tools, it just ends up digging out the pigment from the tooth of the paper and revealing the background color of the paper. But as you can see, I'm making progress with my sky, and I'm adding a little bit of darker blue color at the bottom of these clouds, because the light source is coming from above, so naturally the lower side, which is facing away from that light source, the lower side of those clouds is going to appear a bit darker. And as you can see, I have a lot of these clouds. So now I'm ready to move on to the horizon and to these hills. And there are some trees, distant trees on top of those hills. And for those I'm going to use a very dark green. This is a chrome oxide green, I believe. Obviously, if you're using different brands of colored pencils, those are going to have slightly different colors and slightly different names in their range. But this is probably the darkest green that I have, and because I want these to be pretty dark, that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to switch to some lighter greens as I move closer to the foreground. Now here in the background we also see some distant hills which are much further away than these which are covered with trees on the left. So these on the right are supposed to be much further away, and they're kind of bluish, and they get bluish because of the atmospheric effect. But I first used the ultramarine because it's kind of similar to the sky blue that I used, but a little bit darker. But I'm not sure I'm entirely happy with it. I want maybe a little bit more green in there, so I'm going to use some Prussian blue and some green to experiment with that a little bit to see what it's going to look like. Now as I move a little bit closer to our viewpoint, I'm going to be adding more and more trees on these hills. And I'm going to be adding some rows of trees and bushes in between those fields. The background color of the paper here is going to be helping me quite a bit, because a lot of the fields have this yellowish earth color, and I won't need to do too much in terms of layering to modify the background color of the paper. So that's a good thing about clear gesso, is the fact that you can pick the background color of your paper and you just go over it with clear gesso, and then you can work on top of that. So you can tone the paper with any color you like. You can use gouache or watercolor or whatever, or acrylics, and then you can go over that with clear gesso, and then you have a nice tooth to work with. When I say nice tooth, the tooth is a little bit too much from what I can tell so far, because on fine sandpaper that I normally work with when I do colored pencil drawings. The tooth feels much finer. It grips the color a little bit better, and here it just grinds down on the pencil and produces a lot of residue. So I'm not entirely sure I like that, even though it does work. I would say that it definitely works better than regular paper, because on regular paper you wouldn't be able to get such strong, vibrant colors as you do on this rough textured surface, and you wouldn't be able to work as fast. So coloring in large areas would take a lot more time. I'm going to have some taller trees or groups of trees here in the foreground to the left, but first I have to do a little bit more work on the background. So you can see some of these fields are kind of greenish, some of them are a little bit more yellowish, and some of them have even some reddish colors. So I put a little bit of that sanguine colored pencil on the left, in the middle, which is kind of like a reddish brown. And I'm just making my way down the scene, adding more and more of those distant trees or rows of trees. And the reason why that is kind of helping me make progress with the scene is because whenever I put down a row of trees, that kind of helps me navigate a little bit better, and it helps me understand where I need to put the next element in my composition, because as you can see from the beginning of the video, I didn't make a very detailed sketch. So when you don't have a detailed sketch in place, you have to go with the flow, but you also have to work out the composition as you go along. So if you have a reference photo that you're looking at and you're trying to make it look close to the reference photo, although obviously with landscapes it doesn't have to look exactly the same, these darker elements in the background kind of help you decide where other elements should be placed. So now I'm starting to work on this tree in the foreground, and for the base color I'm going to use a slightly lighter green this time. I'm using like a light yellowish green and also a May green. So I'm going to try to... May green is a little bit lighter than the light yellowish green, but I'm going to try to use these lighter colors here to see what kind of base color I can come up with. Now I also need to draw some tree trunks and branches here, and I'm doing those with a black colored pencil because those are all in the shadow, so might as well use a black pencil for that. Obviously some of these branches and some parts of the tree trunks are going to be obscured by the canopy, so I'm sometimes drawing an interrupted line where I know I'm going to be covering a part of the tree trunk with some canopy and with some foliage. I'm doing this because I'm not really sure how much I can work from dark to light with this surface. From what I can tell so far, there are limitations. It doesn't behave quite like sanded paper, because with sanded paper you can easily add lighter details on top of the darker surfaces, on top of the darker layers. Here, not so much. I'm experiencing a little bit of muddying, which means that this tooth doesn't work quite as well as fine sandpaper. Now I'm using a little bit of black colored pencil on top of those green areas to produce a bit of texture. So if you look at foliage, if you look at canopies of trees at the distance, you will see that it looks like a bunch of greenish and darker, almost black shapes. So darker greens, lighter greens, it kind of looks like a texture of smaller shapes, and that's the kind of texture that I'm trying to produce here. First I laid down the base color, and I'm also going to need a little bit of shadow under the under those trees, and you can see there are multiple trees here. There are multiple tree trunks here, It's like a thicket or a group of trees, a cluster of trees, if you will. And so there's going to be a little bit of shadow under that. And the fields in the background, they're going to have some varied colors. Some of them are going to appear a little bit lighter, others a bit darker, some of them more greenish, others more reddish. So I like a little bit of variation there. And I'm trying to add a little bit of those longer lines to indicate the shape of the furrows on those fields. So now I'm starting to work on the texture and the shape of the tree, because I want to break up this larger shape into smaller shapes by adding some shadow areas in between and breaking those canopies into segments. So if you look at the canopies of trees, you will see that there are clusters, larger clusters of leaves which kind of form around the larger branches and boughs. So I want to break that large shape into those clusters. And once I put those larger shadow areas in place, I'm going to start working on some smaller, finer textures. Another thing to keep in mind is the light source. On scenes like this, which take place outside, obviously the light source is going to be coming from above, but it's usually coming from one side more than the other. So in this case, the light source is more to the left, which means that the right side of this tree is going to be a little bit darker. The same is going to be with other trees and other objects, other elements in the scene. But obviously this lower part of the tree, these lower parts of the canopy and those branches at the bottom are going to be the darkest because they're all in the shadow. But I'm using my pencil to go over the lighter parts of the canopy as well, and I'm just dragging my pencil with very little pressure to produce some random texture on top of those lighter green areas. So I don't want to make them too dark, but I want to modify their color ever so slightly and just add some random texture to them. I'm trying to produce a fine texture that kind of looks like foliage as seen from a distance. This texture is important if you want to create a realistic looking tree, but I think these larger shadow areas are still far more important because they give you an idea about the larger shape of the tree and the actual volume of the tree. They give you the illusion like you're looking at an object that has volume, shape and some kind of depth, because we can see some of these shadow areas in between those larger clusters of leaves. So those parts which are deeper in those canopies, obviously they're going to be in the shadow, and those parts of the canopy which are sticking out, they are catching a bit more light from the light source. So I moved on to the right side of the scene here, and now I'm drawing some distant woods over there on the right, and some of those are going to appear a little bit more bluish than the ones which are in the midground and in the foreground. Like I said, this is because of the atmospheric effect, but as I'm moving closer to the foreground, I'm using more and more of that chrome oxide green, or whatever it's called. And in addition to that, I'm using the slightly lighter chromium green, which is very similar to the darker one, but a little bit lighter, and I think it's also a little bit warmer. So I'm just kind of playing around with colors, but for these distant trees, distant groups of trees, I like to use darker green, and when I feel like it's not dark enough, I can always add a touch of black to it. Now I want to say a few words about that, because sometimes you can produce... This tooth is a little bit rough, and when you're working on these details in the distance, sometimes you can produce a little bit too much texture. Now generally this texture is a good thing because it gives you an illusion of detail, But that's a good thing for the foreground. For the background, you don't really want as much detail, you don't want as much texture. But the good thing about this surface is that you can easily use your blending tools to soften that texture and kind of blur things a little bit. So if you make things which are further away a bit more blurry and you leave a little bit more texture on the elements in the foreground, you'll be able to achieve that illusion, like, you know, when you're looking at things in nature, when you're looking at things outside, the things which are further away appear less detailed to you, and the things which are closer to you, they're going to have a lot more detail. And you can see the same thing in the photos of landscapes. You can see that the trees and the grass and the other stuff, rocks in the foreground, they all have a lot more texture and detail, while the things which are further away will appear less detailed and almost sometimes blurry and out of focus. So that's the effect that I'm trying to create here, and you can imitate that effect by simply controlling the amount of texture that you leave in different parts of your drawing. So for the background, you might want to use a little bit more of the blending tools to soften the texture a little bit, to blur things so that they look less clear and more further away. Whereas for the elements which are closer to the foreground, you just leave more texture, creating that illusion of detail that will capture the attention of the viewer, or entertain the eye of the viewer, kind of tricking it into thinking that they are looking at something that is very, very detailed and that you needed many hours to draw, whereas in fact you just dragged your pencil over this rough tooth of the paper a little bit, and that produced that rough texture and that illusion of detail that kind of looks like either foliage or I don't know, rocks or ground, whatever texture it is that you're trying to produce. Obviously on the sky and the clouds, as you can see, I use blending tools a lot more, so there's a lot less texture there. There are a few more distant trees here on the right, so you can see also that I added a bit of shadow to the right on them. And I did that because I want every element of the scene to interact with the light source. So I'm going to add a little bit of shadow to the right of these trees here, this row of trees as well, because they're all casting a shadow to the right. Like I said, the light source is coming from the left. So I need to stay consistent with that so that my scene would make sense. Anyway, now I'm going to work a little bit more on these fields here in the middle. And this is going to be quick work for the most part, because I'm going to be using the background color of my paper. This is where this yellowish color will be very useful, because I won't need to work hard to cover it and to try to achieve a different color, which is something that I often have to do when I work on sandpaper, because I often have a limited choice of colors and I have to work with very dark backgrounds, and it can be a little bit difficult to cover them thoroughly, and you need to use more of your pencil, you need to use more layers and stuff like that. But here I can just drag my pencil over the surface of the paper a little bit and just add some touches of hue. Maybe if I wanted to appear a little bit more brownish, I can add a bit more brown. Maybe I can add a little bit more of raw umber, maybe a bit of that sanguine with some reddish orangey component in it. And another thing that I can do is I can add these lines here to indicate the shape of the terrain and the flow of the terrain, as well as to indicate the texture of those furrows on those fields. But I have to tell you that this is a little bit more difficult than I expected, because the tooth of the paper is so rough that pulling these fine lines is actually not that easy, because the tooth doesn't allow you to draw very fine lines and draw small details. So maybe that's a disadvantage of this surface. So once again, for those who maybe skipped the beginning of the video, I'm not working on regular paper, I'm working on tone paper which was covered with clear gesso. Clear gesso is like a primer that creates a rough tooth similar to sandpaper, but it's not quite like sandpaper because it's a little bit more rough and less even, and it has both advantages and disadvantages. As you can see, I'm moving closer and closer to the foreground. Now I'm going to draw some large bushes here, and these are going to have a slightly different shape than those trees, a slightly different texture as well, but I'm going to use a similar approach in the sense that I'm just going to lay down the base color, the green first, and then work on top of that with a black colored pencil, creating some texture and some smaller and larger shadow areas, trying to create a more realistic and more three-dimensional looking shape. As you can see, these trees and bushes here in the foreground, they're kind of on top of a hill, and they're kind of overlooking the valley below with all those fields. So now I'm working with a black colored pencil and adding some texture and controlling my pressure, because sometimes I'm just dragging the pencil lightly to create some light random texture, and sometimes I use a little bit more pressure and I use a little bit more of that black colored pencil to create those larger, deeper shadow areas. And another trick that I'm also using a Koh-i-Noor silky black pencil in addition to the Faber-Castell black colored pencil, because I feel like this one is a little bit darker and it goes darker on top of other layers. So you don't have to do that, but I feel like maybe some of these darker areas wouldn't be dark enough if you try to put them on top of the greens. So maybe you would have to plan ahead a little bit more if you plan to use only the Faber-Castell black colored pencil, because I think it's not as dark as this Koh-i-Noor silky black pencil. Anyway, I'm dabbing a little bit with a brush to soften some of the rows of trees and bushes which are further back. I'm not going to be using my blending tools on these trees and bushes in the foreground because I want more texture. And here I also tried to use a bit of the lighter green to add some lighter details, but it didn't really work out that well, I have to tell you so. This is not as good as sandpaper. So for the foreground, I'm gonna make some suggestions of blades of grass here, pulling some of these vertical lines, but varying their angle and size a little bit, so that it appears like the grass which is closer to our viewpoint is obviously taller and larger, and the grass which is further away and closer to those trees and bushes is a little bit shorter and smaller. So I'm varying the shape and the size of my strokes, but I'm also varying the colors a little bit. I added some golden yellowish tones, I added some brownish tones, some greenish tones, and after that I dabbed that with my brush just to make the grass look a bit more natural, because this way, without blending, it would just look like a bunch of lines, but with blending the brush softens everything and makes it gives it a little bit more volume and density, and just makes it look way more natural and realistic. So I'm going in with some lighter pencils here and there to draw some lighter blades of grass, and after I do that, I'm gonna put in some final details because the scene is almost done. So here I added a few more touches of this darker green here and there, just to add some indications of shadow areas in between those taller blades of grass. And after that I added a few lighter details, a few lighter marks here and there for some flowers, some yellowish flowers, and maybe some other colors as well. Some of these flowers which are a little bit closer to our viewpoint are going to appear a little bit larger. Those which are further away are going to appear a bit smaller. So I'm trying to vary the shape and the size a little bit as well. And I'm going to add some lighter marks as well, using an ivory colored pencil for some of the lighter flowers. I want to have a little bit of variation in terms of colors and shapes and things like that. I felt like I didn't have enough contrast here on the right side of this hill, so I introduced a few more bushes here at the bottom on the right, just so that they would stand out more against those fields in the background. So I feel like this way the scene looks a bit better. And now I'm just putting down some finishing touches here and there, just modifying the shape of these trees in the distance a little bit, but the drawing is almost done. I'm just going to put my signature in the lower right corner, and now the drawing is done. So I hope you like this scene. If you like my videos, if you like my landscapes, don't forget to check out my other videos, and also don't forget to subscribe and give me a like and comment. If you want to see longer videos, if you want to see real-time footage, longer explanations, more narration, you should check out my Patreon, because you'll find a lot more content there. Now, for a few final words about clear gesso as a surface with colored pencils, I'm just going to make a couple of comparisons. If you compare it to regular paper, I would say that clear gesso allows you to produce more vibrant colors. It's definitely faster to work with because you have faster coverage, and it's also easier to blend. And it's also a little bit better when it comes to layering, although there are limitations to that. On the other hand, some of the disadvantages in comparison to the regular paper are that there is more residue, and it's also more prone to smudging, and you can't really fix that completely with the use of a spray fixative, because I've tried, and it's better than with pastels, but you can still lift up a little bit of that color. And also another disadvantage is that the tooth can sometimes be a little bit too much if you want to draw some finer details. I mean, this tooth can help you create some interesting looking textures, but in some other situations it can kind of work against you. So here with this landscape, I feel like this surface worked really well, but with some other types of drawings it probably wouldn't work quite as well. Now, if we compare clear gesso with sanded papers, like fine sandpaper, the advantages are that it's faster to work with, and you can choose the background color of your paper, which you can't really do with sandpaper. You can try toning it, but then the tooth doesn't work quite as well. So here you can choose the background color of the paper, which can be very important. If you have a dominant color, which in my scene is this yellowish color. You can also choose the size of the paper, because you may also be limited with the sizes of the paper when it comes to sandpaper. However, there are some disadvantages in comparison to sandpaper as well. The sandpaper holds more layers. It's easier to add smaller, finer details, especially when you're working from dark to light. And there is a lot less residue, so smudging is less of an issue. So there are some advantages and disadvantages. This surface paper covered with clear gesso, it's not great, but it's not that bad either. I think it worked with this landscape, and that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you find some of my conclusions here interesting or useful, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.